Dennis Andrew Nilsen was a British serial killer and necrophile who murdered at least 12 young men and boys between 1978 and 1983 in London, England. Nilsen killed his first victim, 14-year-old Stephen Holmes, on the 30th of December 1978. Holmes encountered Nilsen in the Cricklewood Arms pub, where Holmes had unsuccessfully attempted to purchase alcohol. According to Nilsen, he had been drinking heavily alone on the day he met Holmes before deciding in the evening that he must at all costs leave his flat and seek company. Nilsen invited Holmes to his house with the promise of the two drinking alcohol and listening to music, believing him to be approximately 17 years old. At Nilsen's home, both he and Holmes drank heavily before they fell asleep. The following morning, Nilsen awoke to find Holmes asleep on his bed. In his subsequent written confessions, Nilsen stated he was afraid to wake him in case he left him. After caressing the sleeping youth, Nilsen decided Holmes was to stay with him over the new year whether he wanted to or not. Reaching for a necktie, Nilsen straddled Holmes as he strangled him into unconsciousness, before drowning the teenager in a bucket filled with water. Nilsen then washed the body in his bathtub before placing Holmes on his bed and caressing his body. He twice masturbated over the body, before awaiting the passing of rigor mortis to enable him to stow the corpse beneath his floorboards. Holmes' bound corpse remained beneath the floorboards for almost 8 months, before Nilsen built a bonfire in the garden behind his flat and burned the body on the 11th of August 1979. Nilsen stated, "I eased him into his new bed beneath the floorboards. A week later, I wondered whether his body had changed at all or had started to decompose. I disinterred him and pulled the dirt-stained youth up onto the floor. His skin was very dirty. I stripped myself naked and carried him into the bathroom and washed the body. There was practically no discoloration and his skin was pale white. His limbs were more relaxed than when I had put him down there." Reflecting on his killing spree in 1983, Nilsen stated that, having killed Holmes, "I caused dreams which caused death. This is my crime," adding that he had started down the avenue of death and possession of a new kind of flatmate. On the 11th of October 1979, Nilsen attempted to murder a student from Hong Kong named Andrew Ho, whom he had met in a St. Martin's Lane pub and lured to his flat on the promise of sex. Nilsen attempted to strangle Ho, who managed to flee from his flat and reported the incident to police. Nilsen was questioned in relation to the incident, but Ho decided not to press charges. 2 months after the attempted murder of Ho, on the 3rd of December 1979, Nilsen encountered a 23-year-old Canadian student named Kenneth Ockenden, who had been on a tour of England visiting relatives. Nilsen encountered Ockenden as they both drank in a West End pub. Upon learning the youth was a tourist, Nilsen offered to show Ockenden several London landmarks, an offer which Ockenden accepted. Nilsen then invited the youth to his house on the promise of a meal and further drinks. The pair stopped at an off-license en route to Nilsen's residence and purchased whiskey, rum, and beer, with Ockenden insisting on sharing the bill. Nilsen was adamant he could not recall the precise moment he strangled Ockenden, but recalled that he strangled the youth with the cord of his headphones as Ockenden listened to music. He also recalled dragging the youth across his floor with the wire wrapped around his neck as he strangled him, before pouring himself half a glass of rum and continuing to listen to music on the headphones with which he had strangled Ockenden. The following day, Nilsen purchased a Polaroid camera and photographed Ockenden's body in various suggestive positions. He then laid Ockenden's corpse spread-eagled above him on his bed as he watched television for several hours before wrapping the body in plastic bags and stowing the corpse beneath the floorboards. On approximately 4 occasions over the following fortnight, Nilsen disinterred Ockenden's body from beneath his floorboards and seated the body upon his armchair alongside him as he himself watched television and drank alcohol. Nilsen killed his third victim, 16-year-old Martin Duffy, on the 17th of May 1980. Duffy was a catering student from Birkenhead, Merseyside, who had hitchhiked to London without his parents' knowledge, on the 13th of May after being questioned by the British Transport Police for evading his train fare. For 4 days, Duffy had slept rough near Euston Railway Station before Nilsen encountered the youth as he returned from a union conference in Southport. Duffy, Nilsen recollected, was both exhausted and hungry, and happily accepted Nilsen's offer of a meal and a bed for the evening. After the youth had fallen asleep in Nilsen's bed, Nilsen fashioned a ligature around his neck, then simultaneously sat on Duffy's chest and tightened the ligature with a great force. Nilsen held this grip until Duffy became unconscious. He then dragged the youth into his kitchen and drowned him in his sink before bathing with the body, which he recollected as being the youngest looking I had ever seen. Duffy's body was first placed upon a kitchen chair, then upon the bed on which he had been strangled. The body was repeatedly kissed, complimented and caressed by Nilsen, both before and after he had masturbated while sitting upon the stomach of the corpse. For 2 days, Duffy's body was stowed in a cupboard, before Nilsen noted signs of bloating, therefore, he went straight under the floorboards. Following Duffy's murder, Nilsen began to kill with increasing frequency. Before the end of 1980, he killed a further 5 victims and attempted to murder one other. Only one of these victims whom Nilsen murdered, 26-year-old William David Sutherland, has ever been identified. Nilsen's recollections of the unidentified victims were vague, but he graphically recalled how each victim had been murdered and just how long the body had been retained before dissection. One unidentified victim killed in November had moved his legs in a cycling motion as he was strangled. Another unidentified victim Nilsen had unsuccessfully attempted to resuscitate, before sinking to his knees and sobbing, before standing to expressly spit at his own image as he looked at himself in the mirror. On another occasion, he had lain in bed alongside the body of an unidentified victim as he listened to the classical theme fanfare for the common man before bursting into tears. Inevitably, the accumulated bodies beneath Nilsen's floorboards attracted insects and created a foul odor, particularly throughout summer months. On occasions when Nilsen disinterred victims from beneath the floorboards, he noted that the bodies were covered with pupae and infested with maggots. Some victims' heads had maggots crawling out of eye sockets and mouths. He placed deodorants beneath the floorboards and sprayed insecticide about the flat twice daily, but the odor of decay and the presence of flies remained. In late 1980, Nilsen removed and dissected the bodies of each victim killed since December 1979 and burned them upon a communal bonfire he had constructed on waste ground behind his flat. To disguise the smell of the burning flesh of the 6 dissected bodies placed upon this pyre, Nilsen crowned the bonfire with an old car tire. 3 neighborhood children stood to watch this particular bonfire, and Nilsen later wrote in his memoirs that he felt it would have seemed, in order, if he had seen these 3 children, dancing around a mass funeral pyre. When the bonfire had been reduced to ashes and cinders, Nilsen used a rake to search the debris for any recognizable bones. Noting a skull was still intact, he smashed it to pieces with his rake. Nilsen stated, "I could only relate to a dead image of the person I could love. The image of my dead grandfather would be the model of him at his most striking in my mind. It seems necessary for them to have been dead in order that I could express those feelings which were the feelings I held sacred for my grandfather. It was a pseudo-sexual, infantile love which had not yet developed and matured. The sight of them, my victims, brought me a bitter sweetness and a temporary peace and fulfillment." On or about the 4th of January 1981, Nilsen encountered an unidentified man whom he described for investigators as an 18-year-old, blue-eyed, young Scot at the Golden Lion pub in Soho. He was lured to Melrose Avenue upon the promise of partaking in a drinking contest. After Nilsen and this victim had consumed several beverages, Nilsen strangled him with a tie and subsequently placed the body beneath the floorboards. Nilsen is known to have informed his employers he was ill and unable to attend work on the 12th of January, in order that he could dissect both this victim and another unidentified victim he had killed approximately 1 month earlier. By April, Nilsen had killed 2 further unidentified victims, one of whom he described as an English skinhead whom he had met in Leicester Square, the other he described as a Belfast boy, a man in his early 20s, approximately 5 feet 9 in height, whom he had murdered sometime in February. In relation to the first of these 3 unidentified victims, he later casually reflected, "End of the day, end of the drink, end of a person. Floorboards back, carpet replaced, and back to work at Denmark Street." The following month, Nilsen removed the internal organs of several victims stowed beneath his floorboards. He discarded these innards both upon the waste ground behind his flat, and in his household rubbish. The final victim to be murdered at Melrose Avenue was 23-year-old Malcolm Barlow, whom Nilsen discovered slumped against a wall outside his home on the 17th of September 1981. When Nilsen inquired as to Barlow's welfare, he was informed the medication Barlow was prescribed for his epilepsy had caused his legs to weaken. Nilsen suggested that Barlow should be in hospital and, supporting him, walked him into his residence before phoning for an ambulance. The following day, Barlow was released from hospital and returned to Nilsen's home, apparently to thank him. He was invited in, and after eating a meal, began drinking rum and coke before falling asleep on the sofa. Nilsen manually strangled Barlow as he slept, before stowing his body beneath his kitchen sink the following morning. In mid-1981, Nilsen's landlord decided to renovate 195 Melrose Avenue, and asked Nilsen to vacate the property. Nilsen was initially resistant to the proposal, but accepted an offer of £1,000 from the landlord to vacate the residence. He moved into an attic flat at 23D Cranley Gardens in the Muswell Hill district of North London on the 5th of October 1981. The day before he vacated the property, Nilsen burned the dissected bodies of the last 5 victims he had killed at this address, upon a third and final bonfire he constructed in the garden behind his flat. Again, Nilsen ensured the bonfire was crowned with an old car tire to disguise the smell of burning flesh. Nilsen had already dissected the bodies of 4 of these victims in January and August, and only needed to complete the dissection of Barlow for this third bonfire. At 23 Cranley Gardens, Nilsen had no access to a garden, and as he resided in an attic flat, he was unable to stow any bodies beneath his floorboards. For almost 2 months, any acquaintances Nilsen encountered and lured to his flat were not assaulted in any manner, although he did attempt to strangle a 19-year-old student named Paul Nobbs on the 23rd of November 1981, but stopped himself from completing the act. In March 1982, Nilsen encountered 23-year-old John Howlett while drinking in a pub near Leicester Square. Howlett was lured to Nilsen's flat on the promise of continuing drinking with Nilsen. There both Nilsen and Howlett drank as they watched a film, before Howlett walked into Nilsen's front room and fell asleep in the bed, which was located in the front room at this time. 1 hour later, Nilsen unsuccessfully attempted to rouse Howlett, then sat on the edge of the bed drinking rum as he stared at Howlett before deciding to kill him. Following a ferocious struggle, in which Howlett himself attempted to strangle his attacker, Nilsen strangled Howlett into unconsciousness with an upholstery strap before returning to his living room, shaking from the stress of the struggle in which he had believed he would be overpowered. On 3 occasions over the following 10 minutes, Nilsen unsuccessfully attempted to kill this victim after noting he had resumed breathing, before deciding to fill his bathtub with water and drown him. For over a week following Howlett's murder, Nilsen's own neck bore the victim's finger impressions. In May 1982, Nilsen encountered Carl Stotter, a 21-year-old gay man, as the youth drank at the Black Cat pub in Camden. Nilsen engaged Stotter in conversation, discovering the youth was depressed following a failed relationship. After plying the youth with alcohol, Nilsen invited Stotter to his flat, assuring his guest he had no intention of sexual activity. At the flat, Stotter consumed further alcohol before falling asleep upon an open sleeping bag. He later awoke to find himself being strangled with Nilsen loudly whispering, "Stay still." In his subsequent testimony at Nilsen's trial, Stotter stated he initially believed Nilsen was trying to free him from the zip of the sleeping bag, before he returned to a state of unconsciousness. He then vaguely recalled hearing water running, before realizing he was immersed in the water and that Nilsen was attempting to drown him. After briefly succeeding in raising his head above the water, Stotter gasped the words, "No more, please, no more," before Nilsen again submerged Stotter's head beneath the water. Believing he had killed Stotter, Nilsen seated the youth in his armchair, then noted his mongrel dog, Bleep, licking Stotter's face. Nilsen realized the tiniest thread of life still clung in the youth. He rubbed Stotter's limbs and heart to increase circulation, covered the youth's body in blankets, then laid him upon his bed. When Stotter regained consciousness, Nilsen embraced him. He then explained to Stotter he had almost strangled himself on the zip of the sleeping bag, and that he had resuscitated him. Over the following 2 days, Stotter repeatedly lapsed in and out of consciousness. When Stotter had regained enough strength to question Nilsen as to his recollections of being strangled and immersed in cold water, Nilsen explained he had become caught in the zip of the sleeping bag following a nightmare, and that he had placed him in cold water as he was in shock. Nilsen then led Stotter to a nearby railway station, where he informed the youth he hoped they might meet again before he bade him farewell. 3 months after Nilsen's June 1982 promotion to the position of executive officer in his employment, he encountered a 27-year-old named Graham Allen attempting to hail a taxi in Shaftesbury Avenue. Allen accepted Nilsen's offer to accompany him to Cranley Gardens for a meal. As had been the case with several previous victims, Nilsen stated he could not recall the precise moment he had strangled Allen, but recalled approaching him as he sat eating an omelette with the full intention of murdering him. Allen's body was retained in the bathtub for a total of 3 days before Nilsen began the task of dissecting his body upon the kitchen floor. Nilsen is again known to have informed his employers he was ill and unable to attend work on the 9th of October 1982, likely in order that he could complete the dissection of Allen's body. On the 26th of January 1983, Nilsen killed his final victim, 20-year-old Stephen Sinclair. Sinclair was last seen by acquaintances in the company of Nilsen, walking in the direction of a tube station. At Nilsen's flat, Sinclair fell asleep in a drug and alcohol-induced stupor in an armchair as Nilsen sat listening to the rock opera Tommy. Nilsen approached Sinclair, knelt before him and said to himself, "Oh Stephen, here I go again," before strangling Sinclair with a ligature constructed with a necktie and a rope. Noting crepe bandages upon each of Sinclair's wrists, Nilsen removed these to discover several deep slash marks from where Sinclair had recently tried to kill himself. Following his usual ritual of bathing the body, Nilsen laid Sinclair's body upon his bed, applied talcum powder to the body, then arranged 3 mirrors around the bed before himself lying naked alongside the dead youth. Several hours later, he turned Stephen's head towards him, before kissing the youth's body on the forehead and saying, "Good night, Stephen." Nilsen then fell asleep alongside the body. As had been the case with both Howlett and Allen, Sinclair's body was subsequently dissected, with various dismembered parts wrapped in plastic bags and stored in either a wardrobe, a tea chest or within a drawer located beneath the bathtub. The bags used to seal Sinclair's remains were sealed with the same crepe bandages Nilsen had found upon Sinclair's wrists. Nilsen attempted to dispose of the flesh, internal organs and smaller bones of all 3 victims killed at Cranley Gardens by flushing the dissected remains down his toilet. In a practice which he had conducted upon several victims killed at Melrose Avenue, he also boiled the heads, hands and feet to remove the flesh off these sections of the victims' bodies. On the 4th of February 1983, Nilsen wrote a letter of complaint to estate agents complaining that the drains at Cranley Gardens were blocked, and that the situation for both himself and the other tenants at the property was intolerable. The following day, he refused to allow an acquaintance to enter his property, the reason being he had begun to dismember Sinclair's body on the floor of his kitchen. Nilsen's murders were first discovered by a Dino Rod employee, Michael Catran. Catran responded to the plumbing complaints made by both Nilsen and other tenants of Cranley Gardens on the 8th of February 1983. Opening a drain cover at the side of the house, Catran discovered the drain was packed with a flesh-like substance and numerous small bones of unknown origin. Catran reported his suspicions to his supervisor, Gary Wheeler. As Catran had arrived at the property at dusk, he and Wheeler agreed to postpone further investigation into the blockage until the following morning. Prior to leaving the property, Nilsen and fellow tenant Jim Alcock convened with Catran to discuss the source of the substance. Upon hearing Catran exclaim how similar the substance was in appearance to human flesh, Nilsen replied, "It looks to me like someone has been flushing down their Kentucky Fried Chicken." At 7:30 a.m. the following morning, Catran and Wheeler returned to Cranley Gardens, by which time the drain had been cleared. This aroused the suspicions of both men. Catran discovered some scraps of flesh and 4 bones in a pipe leading from the drain which linked to the top flat of the house. To both Catran and Wheeler, the bones looked as if they originated from a human hand. Both men immediately called the police who upon closer inspection, discovered further small bones and scraps of what looked to the naked eye, like either human or animal flesh in the same pipe. These remains were taken to the mortuary at Hornsey, where pathologist Professor David Bowen advised police that the remains were human, and that one particular piece of flesh he concluded had been from a human neck that bore a ligature mark. Upon learning from fellow tenants that the top floor flat from where the human remains had been flushed belonged to Nilsen, Detective Chief Inspector Peter J. and two colleagues opted to wait outside the house until Nilsen returned home from work. When Nilsen returned home, DCIJ introduced himself and his colleagues, explaining they had come to inquire about the blockage in the drains from his flat. Nilsen asked why the police were interested in his drains and also whether the two officers present with Jay were health inspectors. In response, Jay informed Nilsen that the other two were also police officers, and requested access to his flat to discuss the matter further. The three officers followed Nilsen into his flat, where they immediately noted the odor of rotting flesh. Nilsen questioned further as to why the police were interested in his drains, to which he was informed the blockage had been caused by human remains. Nilsen feigned shock and bewilderment, stating, "Good grief, how awful." In response, Jay replied, "Don't mess about, where's the rest of the body?" Nilsen responded calmly, admitting that the remainder of the body could be found in two plastic bags in a nearby wardrobe, from which DCIJ and his colleagues noted the overpowering smell of decomposition emanated. The officers did not open the cupboard, but asked Nilsen whether there were any other body parts to be found, to which Nilsen replied, "It's a long story, it goes back a long time. I'll tell you everything. I want to get it off my chest. Not here, at the police station." He was then arrested and cautioned on suspicion of murder before being taken to Hornsey Police Station. As he was escorted to the police station, Nilsen was asked whether the remains in his flat belonged to one person or two. Staring out of the window of the police car, he replied, 15 or 16, since 1978. That evening, a Detective Superintendent Chambers accompanied DCIJ and Professor Bowen to Cranley Gardens, where the plastic bags were removed from the wardrobe and taken to Hornsey Mortuary. One bag was found to contain two dissected torsos, one of which had been vertically dissected, and a shopping bag containing various internal organs. The second bag contained a human skull almost completely devoid of flesh, a severed head, and a torso with arms attached, but hands missing. Both heads were found to have been subjected to moist heat. In an interview conducted on the 10th of February, Nilsen confessed there were further human remains stowed in a tea chest in his living room, with other remains inside an upturned drawer in his bathroom. The dismembered body parts were the bodies of three men, all of whom he had killed by strangulation, usually with a necktie. One victim he could not name, another he knew only as John the Guardsman, and the third he identified as Stephen Sinclair. He also stated that, beginning in December 1978, he had killed 12 or 13 men at his former address, 195 Melrose Avenue. Nilsen also admitted to having unsuccessfully attempted to kill approximately 7 other people, who had either escaped or, on one occasion, had been at the brink of death but had been revived and allowed to leave his residence. A further search for additional remains at Cranley Gardens on the 10th of February revealed the lower section of a torso and 2 legs stowed in a bag in the bathroom, and a skull, a section of a torso, and various bones in the tea chest. The same day, Nilsen accompanied police to Melrose Avenue, where he indicated the 3 locations in the rear garden where he had burned the remains of his victims. Under English law, the police had 48 hours in which to charge Nilsen or release him. Assembling the remains of the victims killed at Cranley Gardens on the floor of Hornsey Mortuary, Professor Bowen was able to confirm the fingerprints on one body matched those on police files of Sinclair. At 5:40 p.m. on the 11th of February, Nilsen was charged with Sinclair's murder, and a statement revealing this was released to the press. Formal questioning of Nilsen began the same evening, with Nilsen agreeing to be represented by a solicitor, a facility he had earlier declined. Police interviewed Nilsen on 16 separate occasions over the following days, in interviews which totaled over 30 hours. Nilsen was adamant he was uncertain as to why he had killed, simply saying, "I'm hoping you will tell me that." When he was asked his motive for the murders, he was adamant the decision to kill was not made until moments before the act of murder. Most victims had died by strangulation. On several occasions, he had drowned the victims once they had been strangled into unconsciousness. Once the victim had been killed, he typically bathed the victim's body, shaved any hair from the torso to conform it to his physical ideal, then applied makeup to any obvious blemishes upon the skin. The body was usually dressed in socks and underpants, before Nilsen draped the victims around him as he talked to the corpse. With most victims, Nilsen masturbated as he stood alongside or knelt above the body, and Nilsen confessed to having occasionally engaged in intercrural sex with his victims' bodies, but repeatedly stressed to investigators he had never actually penetrated his victims, explaining that his victims were too perfect and beautiful for the pathetic ritual of commonplace sex. All the victims' personal possessions were destroyed following the ritual of bathing their bodies, in an effort to obliterate their identity prior to their murder and their now becoming what Nilsen described as a prop in his fantasies. In several instances, he talked to the victim's body as it remained seated in a chair or prone on his bed, and he recalled being emotional as he marveled at the beauty of their bodies. With reference to one victim, Kenneth Ockenden, Nilsen noted that Ockenden's body and skin were very beautiful, adding the sight almost brought me to tears. Another, unidentified victim had been so emaciated that he had simply been discarded under the floorboards. All the bodies of the victims killed at Melrose Avenue were dismembered after several weeks or months of internment beneath the floorboards. Nilsen recalled that the putrefaction of these victims' bodies made this task exceedingly vile. He recalled having to fortify his nerves with whiskey and having to grab handfuls of salt with which to brush aside maggots from the remains. Often, he vomited as he dissected the bodies, before wrapping the dismembered limbs inside plastic bags and carrying the remains to the bonfires. Nonetheless, immediately prior to his dissecting the victims' bodies, Nilsen masturbated as he knelt or sat alongside the corpse. This, he stated, was his symbolic gesture of saying goodbye to his victims. When questioned as to whether he had any remorse for his crimes, Nilsen replied, "I wished I could stop, but I couldn't. I had no other thrill or happiness." He also emphasized that he took no pleasure from the act of killing, but worshipped the art and the act of death. Nilsen was brought to trial on the 24th of October 1983, charged with 6 counts of murder and 2 of attempted murder. He was tried at the Old Bailey before Mr. Justice Croom Johnson and pleaded not guilty on all charges. Following the closing arguments of both prosecution and defense, the jury retired to consider their verdict on the 3rd of November 1983. The following day, the jury returned with a majority verdict of guilty upon 6 counts of murder and 1 of attempted murder, with a unanimous verdict of guilty in relation to the attempted murder of Nobbs. Croom Johnson sentenced Nilsen to life imprisonment with a recommendation that he serve a minimum of 25 years imprisonment. The minimum term of 25 years imprisonment to which Nilsen was sentenced in 1983 was replaced by a whole life tariff by Home Secretary Michael Howard in December 1994. This ruling ensured Nilsen would never be released from prison, a punishment he accepted. On the 10th of May 2018, Nilsen was taken from HMP Full Sutton to York Hospital after complaining of severe stomach pains. He was found to have a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm which was repaired, although he subsequently suffered a blood clot as a complication of the surgery. Nilsen died on the 12th of May. A subsequent post-mortem examination revealed that the immediate cause of Nilsen's death was pulmonary embolism and retroperitoneal hemorrhage. Nilsen's body was cremated in June 2018. This service was held with only 5 mourners present, including 3 prison officers and the individual with whom Nilsen had corresponded while in prison. No family members were present at the service. In line with Ministry of Justice policy, HMP Full Sutton paid £3,323 towards the cost of Nilsen's funeral. His ashes were later handed to his family. Thanks for watching. For more videos please click like and subscribe.